that Sam Sharpe did anticipate Gandhi and MLK and other freedom movements, even some violent freedom movements through his methodology. And the more you look at the Jamaican uprising, at least this was the case with me, I began to think that some of these methods are actually almost encoded into the collective consciousness of humanity. That Sam Sharpe didn't invent these techniques so much as he discovered them, as generations hence would discover them, that it actually works. And what I'm talking about here is, again, in that literate and so-called elite, strata of oppressed peoples, you gain some knowledge about how the oppressive structure works. You cultivate through secret networks a group of lieutenants, then you develop small cells, small decentralized little groups of people who share the ideology, are able to communicate the ideology. But to stamp out one of those cells is not to break the movement.
Like ants in a colony, organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to Subversive History. Today we are joined by author and journalist Tom Zoellner. Professor Zoellner teaches English at Chapman University and is also the author of numerous books, including the subject of today's discussion, Island of Fire, the Revolt that Ended Slavery in the British Empire. Here on Subversive History, we were doing a number of interviews that related to Haitian history, some of which also concerned the Haitian slave revolt. We interviewed Gerald Horne on his book on that topic. And while we were doing those interviews, I came across your book because I wanted to further educate myself on the uprisings that occurred in the Caribbean that ultimately led to the abolition of slavery. And that's how I came across your book. And I thought your book was a fantastic account of that story. And we're very grateful that you gave us some time for the interview today.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Thank you so much. So I guess my first question, I think it's helpful to start on kind of like a personal note. What inspired you to write a book about these events in Jamaica?
Sure. I mean, these events in Jamaica are well known in the Caribbean, but not so much in the United States. It's possible to have a high school and collegiate education without ever hearing about the real reasons why slavery was abolished in the British Empire. And in fact, I've talked to many friends from the United Kingdom who've told me that their awareness of slavery within their own colonial sphere was quite limited. If they get anything, it's about the heroism of the abolitionists in Britain, William Wilberforce and company, and they don't learn much about how the empire actually conducted the sugar economy, the triangle trade, or the real causes of abolition, which had far more to do with the resistance of the enslaved people.
So before we get into the actual revolt itself, your book gives a pretty harrowing detail of what life was like in Jamaica prior to the revolt and the subsequent abolition of slavery. So just to kind of give our listeners an idea of what life was like in Jamaica as an enslaved person at that time, and essentially the conditions that necessitated some form of a revolt.
The best comparison, although imperfect, would be the American West in the late 19th century, a time for adventurers from the East to come out and make a great fortune, if they could, through wits and daring, and not coincidentally through oppression of others in the name of territorial conquest or labor. And this is what happened in the Caribbean. They were called the Sugar Islands. They were described by King George III as a mine of constant wealth. Sorry, an associate of King George III's. It was where you could make roughly 22 times that of what an immigrant to New England could make. And what you did was, through means fair or foul, you would try and get control of as much land as possible, a little capital, and sugar, which is not a scientifically difficult crop to grow in that climate, You'd get a small band of enslaved people to plant that for you, to harvest it, to boil it down to molasses, to ship it back to England, and use that capital to buy more and more land and more slaves. And you could truly become just, filthy, stupid rich in this method. And life in Jamaica for the white settlers was also fabulously gluttonous when it came to the lifestyle that many led, laced with heavy drinking at all hours, with forced sexual relations with enslaved women, with a kind of Araviste kind of devil may care approach to life, without a good deal of empathy for the suffering that was caused.
Right. And like, when it came, I know that your book, I don't even really want to, it's so explicit. Some of the things that I read in the book, the punishments of slaves that were occurring in Jamaica at this time, the one where, they put, excrement in someone's mouth and sew their mouth, or, force their mouth closed and things like that for periods of time. Like, some of the punishments that I read about in the book just seemed like something out of almost like a horror fiction.
Yeah, just as abusers throughout history have tried to minimize the scale of their abuses or to cover it up in euphemistic language, that was also the case with some of the plantation owners in Jamaica, who would present a picture of happy and contented field laborers, never slaves,
Right.
who were somehow better off for this type of treatment than they would have been in Africa. And they rarely talked about the actual mechanics of field discipline, which did involve that punishment that you described, something called Derby's dose. And most of what we know about this comes from the diary of one man, Thomas Thistlewood, who was extraordinarily candid in what he would write, albeit without much regret. Something else should be said about that, the Thistlewood diary, which is remarkable. This thing went on for volumes and volumes and volumes, covered 30 years of this guy's life. And before he came to Jamaica, he had a bit of a squeamish stomach towards this kind of punishment, the brutality that was meted upon the enslaved people. And for the first couple of weeks that he's there, he is a bit grossed out by what he sees. But within a few weeks, he's starting to do the whipping himself. And this was entirely characteristic of some of those migrants from Britain who might have had some misgivings about the system of enslavement, about the types of practices that were done, rumored about outside of view of the general public. But they got acclimated, they got used to it, and they began to justify it to themselves. And they would see some of the myriad ways in which the enslaved people were resisting, either through refusing to work, vandalizing the master's property, running away. Resistance in the Caribbean was an ongoing matter. We didn't just see it during the Haitian Revolution or during the Christmas uprising. It was always there. Mm-hmm. And this is part of the rationale that white slave owners used to justify their crackdowns. They were keenly aware that they were numerically totally outmatched, 10-1. And should the enslaved people ever find the solidarity and the means for binding together, finding a common purpose and enacting real coordinated physical resistance, they wouldn't have had a chance, not even with the Royal Navy.
And I know this from reading some books about Haiti during the similar time period. I'm not sure if this is specifically mentioned in your book because I just don't recall, but I know that in Haiti, the population of enslaved people would be majority enslaved people that had been brought from Africa as opposed to ones that had been born in Haiti because the conditions were so precarious for the enslaved people. Was it similar to that in Jamaica as well?
Yes, there was a constant mix of what you might call Creoles, those who had been there for a time, were native born in Jamaica, though in slavery. And those who were brought over in the continuance of the slave trade before it was outlawed in 1807. Of course, there were still blockade runners that managed to get African slaves even after that date, but it was a minority. And this resulted in a bit of a class system among the enslaved people themselves, who tended to view those who spoke the King's English, albeit in a patois, and those who were still monolingual and an African tongue. That created a divide, an obvious divide, as did the sense of the driver system. And who a driver was, it was essentially almost a prison trustee, someone who had been deputized by the owner of the estate, or what was called the attorney, the guy who managed the estate in his absence, would often find one of the strongest guys, the most respected guys among the enslaved people, typically an older guy with some technical expertise and a certain demeanor that made everyone respect him. And they would make that guy the driver, who was then responsible for getting everyone up on time, getting them harvesting sugar efficiently, and enforcing discipline within the enslaved people's village, within the plantation, and essentially creating a viceroy. This also created a class system. And if I can make one more point on this, it was from that upper tier of educated and trusted enslaved people that was the seedbed of the attempted revolution. Those enslaved people who could read and who were respected and could cultivate networks that went beyond the sugar estate, and they were often serving as church deacons and were permitted to go from plantation to plantation to give Bible lessons. Those were the ones who were the chief and the lieutenants. And this is the case often with revolutionary movements throughout the globe. This is kind of a trans-historical phenomenon, that it's sometimes the people in the oppressed group who are closest to the dominant class who are the ones who are most able to mount an effective uprising.
And yeah, just something else on that point, a question that I wanted to ask, because here, like our project here, Subversive History, it's very literature focused. We're very, very much interested in the written historical record, reviewing it, hopefully interviewing people that write it. And the question I wanted to ask, as an example of Jamaica, or just broadly for these kinds of revolutionary movements, is can you speak on the catalyst of literacy as a tool of liberation, like the effect that literacy has on revolutionary liberation movements?
Absolutely, and this was crucial to understanding what happened in Jamaica. And you can either thank or blame, depending on your perspective, the Protestant missionaries who were barred from Jamaica until the early 1920s, when a kind of a liberalizing effect, almost a bit of a mini springtime. Some slave owners thought, well, wouldn't it be good if we could teach just a little bit of morality to the people that we're enslaving, and it might cause them to be more obedient. And so this was also concurrent with the Wesleyan Revolution in Protestantism in the United Kingdom. Church of England rector named John Wesley had a calling to spread the gospel to those who were not in the elite of Britain, those who were particularly in the north of Britain. And he famously went on horseback rides of great duration, preached to perhaps 250,000 people underneath trees, inside coal mines, and created the movement that we now call Methodism. This was some of the energy of sending missionaries into Jamaica, the belief that Christ's gospel is open to all, no matter how despised your social situation, and that enslaved people were not demi-human, but they were fully human, and that they too could participate in the liberating message of resurrection and hope. And so They were not uniformly welcomed. Several plantation owners thought that these missionaries were the scum of the earth, and how dare you come in here and start talking to my people like this. Jamaica was not a religious place by and large. There was the official stamp of the Church of England as kind of a registry of documents, but these are more or less fairly irreligious guys who were running these plantations. But those who reluctantly would let missionaries in found, if they didn't know already, that part of Protestant theology, heavily centered on Scripture as it is, means literacy. That you're going to have to learn how to read if you want to read what's in God's Word. And they taught some of the elite class of slaves, that enslaved people that I was mentioning, they taught them how to read. This was prior to the 1820s, really kind of verboten thing to do. You would not want to teach any of your enslaved people to read lest they pick up abolitionist literature,
right?
Lest they gain a certain power.
Well, and that was some of the punishments of, I think, the Nat Turner Rebellion, or it might have been the Stono Rebellion in the American colonies, was like, we need to teaching a slave to read must be illegal from this point forward. Like after that would come in the wake of rebellions, right?
Right, and this is where news from in the U.S. context, the nation's capital, or in the British context, Parliament in London. This is where that kind of news was dangerous news, because it, would tell anyone, including an enslaved person who read any of those accounts, that hey, there's actually people in this country who are opposed to this practice, and who are fighting for you.
Yeah.
To let your enslaved people know that they have secret friends in the North or secret friends in Britain, that's very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
In the United States in 1829, there was an infamous tract written by a guy named David Walker, an African American named David Walker, called An Appeal to Reason, which called for an uprising of enslaved people. And while there's no evidence that Nat Turner actually read this document, it nevertheless struck fear into the hearts of Southern plantation owners that anyone who reads this is going to get ideas. And back to Jamaica, so too was it with some of those hot verses in the Bible that speak about you can't serve two masters. There is neither Greek nor Jew, slave nor free, male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus, it says in the book of Ephesians. You don't want your enslaved person reading that because, again, it implies a liberation which is more than a heavenly liberation, but quite possibly an earthly liberation. And this is exactly what an educated, charismatic enslaved man named Samuel Sharpe, he began to intersperse his Bible lessons that he was giving to the workers on the plantations. He began to weave a revolutionary message in there and say, look, this is an illegitimate system of power that's over you. He didn't use those words, but that was the effect of it. Like, these guys have no right to enslave you, and they need to pay you. And what we're going to do is Christmas, 1831, and the Christmas season was, of course, when there would be a 2-day holiday, and there would be almost a sort of ritual blowing off of steam on all the sugar estates. It was customary to give them 2 days off. That's when we're going to hatch our plot. We're not going to hurt anyone. This is not going to be Haitian style. We're not going to slay anyone in their beds. We're going to sit down and demand half the wages, a modest ask. We're going to ask for half the wages that a free person would get for chopping sugar.
And I know this is something that you also kind of discuss in your book, and it's the debate, I guess, historical debate as to what were the initial aims of Sam Sharpe's resistance here. Some people say that it was a project of armed resistance from its inception. Other people say that it was intended to be like a peaceful kind of strike, as you just alluded to now. Can you kind of speak to that historical debate that goes on?
Certainly. This is the key historiographical debate around the Christmas uprising. whether it was an attempt to have a full-blown workers' revolution and a black independent republic, or whether it was simply almost a labor strike, as you say. And the view on this depends, of course, on the historian doing the recounting. And in certainly the Caribbean and to some extent the United States, the discipline of history in the 1960s and 1970s, during the time of colonial independence from Great Britain, and during the time when there was great excitement around the world among communist governments about flipping some of these post-colonial powers into communist nations. Such had been done to Cuba, such had been done to Angola, such had almost been done to the former Belgian Congo. That there was an attempt to convince those who had lived there that they had always been sort of naturally communist. And the political party, the PNP in Jamaica, which was then in power and was then making overtures to Cuba, making some overtures to Russia. Some of its educated spokespeople were well trained in Marxism. And when some of the very first, the serious post-colonial historiography was being done on Sam Sharpe, there was an attempt to frame him as a revolutionary against an industrial hegemonic power, that this was in the classic mold of workers' rebellions. And I don't fully agree with that, but I don't fully disagree, because this really did come down to a strike against working conditions. But if you ignore the spiritual aspect of what he was trying to do, that's also, I think, a misread of what was going on.
Yeah, and so we kind of just touched on like what was the genesis of the whole thing, what were the aims, but what played out in the actual events of the rebellion. Because I know in your book you point to some things that lend credence to the theory that this was intended to be, at least to some degree, a peaceful resistance. And I think you point to like the lack of wide-scale destruction of some of the larger sugar estates, because there was a future in mind that we have to keep this stuff operational so that we can continue to be an economic entity after we've successfully revolted.
Sure. We're talking about a movement of 60,000 people that didn't have a high degree of central control. There was a rough consensus, but a lot of people were saying a lot of different things within that movement. There was that thought that, hey, once we kick the whites off the island, we're going to take this stuff over and run it ourselves. And so let's not, cut off our nose here. But you look at the actual patterns of destruction, and you're right, it was fairly minimal. Estates were destroyed, but, the initial spot of burning was almost always the trash house, which is where you kept the waste product from the sugarcane, the bagasse in French, the parts of the sugarcane that were not useful for consumption, but were useful for starting the fires underneath the boilers. That's where the fires started that were lit almost immediately on the night of December 27th. But I think the evidence indicates this was not so much to, as the phrase goes, burn down the master's house, but rather to send up a signal that could be seen, a visible signal that we're doing this and we are going to sit down. And for me, the most compelling bit of evidence that this was not ultimately a violent island-wide revolution at its core intention was that only in the course of 6 weeks of violence, and considering the numerical strength of the enslaved people and what they could have done, there's evidence for only 2 white casualties. And both of them were as a consequence of direct combat. There were no premeditated murders, such as there were in Haiti. There was not an attempt to just assassinate white owners at all. And that speaks very loudly to me of the essentially nonviolent character of this uprising.
Right. And you cite several examples, I believe, where enslaved people that knew of the coming rebellion would kind of go and let the owners of the plantation know, like not necessarily acquiescing to them and taking their side, but being like, hey, this thing's coming. You might want to get out of here. I think the one that actually sticks out to me is one of the enslaved people went to the owner and said, hey, you better get out of here. And the owner said, okay, well, can you help me get some of my valuables together and help me take them down to the boat or whatever it is. And the enslaved person said, well, I don't work for free anymore. So it's like they had like the compassion enough to be like, hey, you might want to roll out of here, but also had conviction enough in the movement to be like, but I'm not helping you carry your stuff. I'm not your slave anymore.
Right, and even for those who were not active revolutionaries or even participating in the sit down strike, there was the general affinity for what was going on. And also, a word should be said here about the reliability of this written testimony.
Right.
Almost never was an enslaved person allowed to really sort of say what was on their minds. And a lot of what we have is through the interlocution of white inquisitors.
Right.
So very clearly, as a survival strategy, you're going to say different things to different people. And so we have the testimony of what they actually did. You cited a good example of that. There are stories of some enslaved people burying the master's valuables and keeping them away from those who wanted to take those valuables in the heat of the uprising. There was no one way to characterize the relationship between masters and their enslaved people. I mean, it had different shapes depending on what role you occupied on the plantation, and also the disposition of the owner or the attorney. Most of them were quite cruel. Some of them viewed themselves, as kind of liberalizers, as kinder masters. I think obviously that's still open to harsh critique, but they did see themselves as kind of practitioners of a better, kinder way of enslavement. And it was noted in some of the white papers. Every paper was white in Jamaica, but it was noted in the press that some of those masters who were, either famous or notorious for being, lenient masters saw lesser property destruction.
And so would you say, just based on all of that evidence, that the aspirations of Sam Sharpe and those that revolted with him was more of like a plan A, plan B type of situation where it's like, we're going to peacefully refuse to work as a slave any longer. We will demand our right for just humane employment. But if that is not accepted, then we will resort to violent means to achieve that.
Yes, that is the view of a Jamaican scholar named Vereen Shepherd, and I largely agree with her on this. But I would maybe differ with her in one respect, as far as the meeting violence with violence codicil of that, the Plan B that you mentioned. I think that was improvised. I don't know that there was a centralized plan to fight back if they were fought against. Of course they were going to get fought against. Mm-hmm. And there's absolutely no evidence to indicate that Sam Sharpe advocated this, but there is evidence that some of his lieutenants had talked amongst themselves prior to the first sit-downs on the night of December 27th, and said, look, if we get shot at, we're going to shoot back. We're not going to willingly just sort of go to the gallows here.
Which is a death sentence, right? Like to go to that point and then just say like, okay, they didn't accept it. That's effectively a death sentence to the gallows if you weren't to fight back from that point.
Yeah, so far as they knew at that time, if they sat down and didn't work, it was going to be either long imprisonment, torture, or the gallows. And mercy was extended on the part of the island militia and certainly the Royal Navy when they got involved to try and put this rebellion down. They made it clear that if you did sit down and refuse to work, even though we could hang you we're going to pardon you if you get back to work right now. This was not, this was a leniency not extended to the leaders of the revolution who were indeed executed when they were caught.
And just on that point, the leaders being executed when they were caught, can you kind of describe like the finale of this revolt, like how it came to an end in Jamaica?
Yeah, I mean, there was no one climactic Battle of Yorktown or, signing of a peace treaty on the deck of the USS Missouri to this. It was, it died in spits and sputters, as most uprisings do. It started, as I said, on December 27th, 1831. It was largely over by mid-February, which is in the long history of Caribbean slave revolts. This was the longest.
Right.
And let's accept the Haitian Revolution on this.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, you might correct that fast.
Yeah.
But as far as revolutions that were successfully suppressed, as this one was, this was the largest and the biggest and the longest. And I would argue the one which had the most geopolitical impact. And we can maybe talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
But it was mopped up in sporadic fashion, and really only, I think, in the last kind of event that you might put on it was the hanging of Sam Sharpe on May 23rd, 1832. And he had been convicted in a trial that actually had some witnesses and some documentation, which was quite unlike the drumhead court-martials that you saw for most of them. And it rested on the testimony of somewhat suspicious testimony, as my book goes into, on whether Sam Sharpe had carried a weapon during the revolt. I mean, they were going to get him no matter what, but they really wanted to, have a gun in his hands, if you will, even though there's no evidence that he shot anyone.
And then, just as you had alluded to prior, like obviously the effects of this rebellion would reverberate to the mother country, England. What was the response and effect from England as a result of this uprising?
Galvanizing. Every slave uprising did what was made known in Britain. The press, it must be said, was remarkably free. By 18th and 19th century standards. I was, constantly surprised at the bluntness of some of it. You think of the United Kingdom as obviously a monarchy, and even a kind of a coercive monarchy in terms of what people were allowed to say, but they were allowed to say quite a bit. And Sam Sharpe's rebellion, once the news reached British shores in February, it took that long for ships to get across the Atlantic, really was a lightning bolt in terms of the understanding that this institution was really costly, not just cruel, but costly, and that it was going to be a big military expenditure to keep up the maintenance of the Royal Navy, to suffer the disruptions in the sugar market, and increasingly just to kind of be an embarrassment, a moral embarrassment on British prestige, and sapping some of their ability to make American-style freedom arguments to those other powers that they were trying to compete with.
From what I gather from reading your book is that there was two main currents of British support for abolition. One was seemed to be kind of a sincerely egalitarian view of slavery is wrong, whether influenced from religion or some other moral dimension. And then the other current being kind of like a more pragmatic fear of revolt, that this is no longer sustainable, that maybe from an economic or a hegemonic perspective, we would like to maintain the system of slavery. However, it's become, as you said, too costly or too dangerous for the settlers to continue the institution. Can you speak to those two currents of support for abolition in Britain?
Yeah, you've nailed it quite well. This really was a two-pincer argument, and it's sort of voguish among historians and in particular Marxist historians to really, I think, wave away the humanitarian arguments, and even though those are what most people do find compelling about the continuing existence of slavery, there's a desire to frame the whole thing in strictly capitalist language and make the point that only when you hit these guys in the pocketbook do you do away with this venomous system, when it becomes almost anti-capitalist to keep maintaining it. And this is one of the premier scuffles when it comes to the etiology of emancipation. Was it out of almost a suicide, ecocide, as one scholar has put it, that they did it in spite of their own economic interest? Or was it, in the more classic formulation, most prominently by a Trinidadian scholar named Eric Williams, who wrote in this revered work called Capitalism and Slavery, the idea that abolition came only when it became economically unsustainable.
Right, like the Marxian idea that there is these currents of economic production and organization that will become outmoded to the point where it will necessitate a revolution. Like, for example, like capitalism, the contradiction of capitalism will become so stark that a revolution will be inevitable. It is a scientific fact of social development that there will be this. You're saying that there's other elements to that, and that's a little bit too simplistic, because obviously there is the economic element that is going to be big, but it's not the sole motivator.
Right. And slavery in the 1830s was a thoroughly modern institution as we understand modernity. And certainly in the American South, insofar as being quite up to date on the latest innovations, incredible savvy with markets. There's every reason to believe that British slavery would have continued to have meant huge profits. And so to denigrate the idea that some of the votes in Parliament weren't out of a certain compassion or religious conviction, that's just not true. But it's also not true to acknowledge that there was a cold-blooded aspect to this, almost similar to the United States. I keep making American analogies, but
please do. Yeah, I think
here we are, almost similar to the American calculus of getting out of Vietnam in the early 1970s. That this is just costing too much,
right?
And that this is just going to be this continual guerrilla warfare, and there's a lot of domestic opposition at home, and it just isn't politically sustainable. Something that is very important about this whole thing was that Sam Sharpe's uprising occurred concurrently to the passage of the Reform Act,
right?
Which, for those who don't know, was a long-needed house cleaning of Parliament and a way of extending representation to some of the geographies in the UK, which had just exploded in population and clout, economic clout, because of the Industrial Revolution, but yet didn't have a voice in Parliament. The island was ridden with what was called rotten boroughs. These places where a handful of people lived, but they still had this immense voice in Parliament. And to make another very imperfect American analogy, it's similar to Wyoming having the same voice in the U.S. Senate as California, with just an absurd disparity in population. So suddenly you had, all these guys, all these women that John Wesley, the Methodist preacher, had started to reach, who were now not just working in coal mines and, harvesting, barley in the fields, but they were moving to places like Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, so forth. They were working in factories, and suddenly had a newfound political voice, that they could put some radical representation in Parliament. And this is part of the great British breakthrough here, which is that these voices from on the factory floor were able to draw a sympathetic link in between their own position and those Afro-Caribbeans who they would never meet, never quite understand, but that there was somehow a commonality of interest, that the oppression that the wage earners were under in these horrible conditions in the factories were similar to the factories in the fields under a tropical sun.
So obviously, as the title of your book suggests, it's that this slave revolt had a profound influence on the coming official abolition of slavery in the British Empire. We're kind of talking right now about the different factors that motivated that, some being egalitarian, a moral perspective, some being economic. In the beginning of this, you had mentioned that there is, I think, in the historical record, or at least the Orthodox historical record, an undue amount of fixation on the moral aspect and not enough on the resistance aspect. So can you kind of just explain how essential the act of resistance was into actually reaching abolition?
Sure. I mean, this made huge news. I went back and read the British papers coverage of this, thanks to digitization, in 1832. And it was galvanizing insofar as the amount of ink that was spilled on this, to the point where even Liverpool, which was, as Chicago was to American beef, Liverpool was to British slavery, or to make another analogy, as Detroit would later be to cars.
Right.
Liverpool was the city that profited most from slavery, not just in terms of being the depot for the ships that would travel to Africa, kidnap people and take them to the Caribbean. But even after the abolition of the slave trade, you had most of the manufacture of the goods and implements necessary to run a plantation that were manufactured and sold in Liverpool. Manacles, ropes, chains, agricultural implements. There was this immense profit off of a trade where they would never get to see the misery up close. Even in Liverpool, you had a tremendous energy around abolition, of the sense of, we have to get rid of this. Now, when it comes to which was the more important motivation, was it humanitarianism and Christianity, or was it the bank ledger and the counting house? There's not an easy answer to that, but I think an important point of this is that the abolitionists and the Christian missionaries, were not these naive guys with halos over their heads. They were savvy political actors, and they saw the opportunity to go in there and get what they wanted, which was obviously the abolition of slavery for moral reasons. But they made the point to those who were finally in a position to, reluctantly listen. Don't just do this because it's a nice thing to do, but why don't you do this because guess what? There's going to be more Sam Sharpes who are going to be arising on your sugar estate and maybe killing your family.
Yeah.
And costing you X amount of pounds.
Yeah.
And to the taxpayers in general, do you really want to be paying for, this permanent garrison on every British sugar island? There were 11 of them. That's
right.
A lot of ships and a lot of guns.
So we've covered the abolitionist movement in Britain and how that ultimately culminated in abolition in the British Empire. But can you now speak to the response from the United States of Sam Sharpe's rebellion and the subsequent abolition that it resulted in?
Sure. For enslaved people, of course, it was absolutely a euphoric development as far as a leading nation of the world who does away with this whole system. And among enslaved or freed enslaved people and New England abolitionists, the actual date of the effective emancipation, August 1st, became a preeminent holiday, more important even than July 4th. And this was celebrated with picnics and speeches, primarily in, of course, the hotbed of abolitionism in Massachusetts, but also out in the northern frontier, Indiana, Ohio, so forth. So it was a huge hope for that segment of American society. But you can guess the segment of American society that was horrified by this development.
John C. Calhoun.
John C. Calhoun, who was at the time Secretary of State, and who viewed this not just with the predictable response that, oh my God, here's yet another potential Black Republic on the doorstep of the United States, and here's enslaved people who are gaining a form of citizenship. but he saw it actually as a more geopolitically as, oh my gosh, this is that, you know, John Bull. This is Great Britain. This is our great rival who we, you know, not coincidentally just, you know, 16 years ago fought a war with. This is their way to mess with us.
Yeah.
And they're going to, from their new, you know, do-gooder abolitionist base in Jamaica, they're going to send potential revolutionaries
Right.
into Louisiana, into Pensacola, into Charleston, to spread these dangerous ideas among our own enslaved people. And that we're going to have to face all these uprisings. And they're going to get in and try and get their piece of the North American pie back from us. And so this rush, this conspiracy theory, which is what it was,
Right.
resulted in the ultra fast annexation of Texas as a way to, you know, keep planting that American flag further and further westward to keep the evil British, you know, out of the American sphere of influence.
So, like, just keeping in mind, like, obviously you had somewhat of a different response from Britain and the United States, or should I say maybe after following the abolition from Britain, where you still had a slaveholding empire in the United States. What do some of these responses imply for some of the hypocrisies of liberalism, meaning that we have these liberal states that have these constitutions that say, at least nominally, that all men are created equal, and et cetera. What is their response to these emancipatory movements that are for liberty? What does it say about certain hypocrisies that existed within liberalism at that time?
Yeah, certainly. One of the great historiographic fights of the founding of the United States has been whether the Constitution was truly a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery document.
Right.
And this was of great concern to the abolitionists, the American abolitionists. Famously, William Lloyd Garrison, the publisher of The Liberator in Boston, and one of the loudest voices for immediate abolition, called it a covenant with hell and a deal with the devil, and he would publicly set fire to the Constitution in public spaces. And yeah, kind of make a mockery out of, as you say, the supposed liberalism of the framers of the Constitution, most notoriously Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
That they really were not for the universal rights of man. And, you know, a word should be said that this is more complicated, obviously, as most things are. That
Right.
Jefferson expressed many ambivalences and doubts about the institution that he was running.
I love the one quote that you included of him that said that having a nation with slavery is like holding a wolf by both ears. Inevitably, that wolf will get away, but if you elected to voluntarily let go of it, it's going to still attack you the same way. And I think that's a really apt description of the paradoxical and contradictory nature of trying to own enslaved people.
Yes, and I'm really glad you cited that, because that is one of the huge fallacies of that point of view that Thomas Jefferson had, and that many slaveholders, they would try to make the argument that, hey, if we let these guys go, it's going to be chaos. And, you know, they're going to pick up arms and take their revenge pretty quick, and it's going to be a bloodbath. The British Parliament was so concerned about this that they sent investigators to take all these, what amounts to depositions from people who had been present during what's been called North America's first abolition,
right,
which was the elimination of slavery from northern territories, which happened in the late 18th and early 19th century. I forget the exact date of New York State abolition, but, you know, that didn't come without some of the Jeffersonian hand-wringing of the wolf by the ears and all that. And there was just no evidence that could be found, even in the 1830s, that there was any truth to this, and that the fact was that legal abolitions almost always went off quite peacefully.
Right.
I mean, we can argue, and we should argue, about the later injustices that would follow those abolitions. Most notoriously in the United States, the failed Reconstruction
Right.
that we had, and the descent of Jim Crow and the reestablishment of white supremacy. That's a different matter than what they had originally waved around as a great cautionary note, which was the idea of a violent legalized abolition. It just never happened. And so that's where Jefferson, one of the many places that he was wrong.
And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think it's a really important point to expound upon a little bit further. And that's the kind of fear mongering that occurred among, whether it be Jamaica or whether it be Haiti or whether it be the United States or any sector of the world that is in the business of slavery. And it's that it goes back to the wolf analogy that, well, if we grant them their freedom, then that will be an existential threat for us, because once they're freed, they will obviously be hell-bent on vengeance, and they will enact it indiscriminately and slaughter every white person they can see. This is also reminiscent of certain, certain apprehensions to ending apartheid in South Africa, that this type of thing would occur. So can you speak to that, like you had said, in the legal abolitionists, there was a remarkably low degree of violent retribution. So let's stay on Jamaica, for example. After the abolition occurred, there was no apocalyptic retribution, correct? Didn't happen. Maybe we can just talk about that for a second. What did happen when they said, "Hey, everyone's free"? What was the assimilation process like?
Sure. I mean, there was a middle period called apprenticeship, which
Right.
was a euphemism for continued slavery until they
hopefully temporary slavery.
Yeah, exactly. It lasted only 4 years. Everyone acknowledged this was a bad idea, and full emancipation happened on August 1st, 1838. And you didn't immediately, of course, you didn't see an immediate change in any sort of socioeconomic hierarchy. The people who were working in the sugar fields prior to the uprising continued to work in the sugar fields, albeit with wages and without, not in all cases, but in most cases, without the whip. And you had a program of greater literacy, greater ability to worship. You had what was called, in religious history terms, the Jamaican Awakening, where the entire island was evangelized, and up to 98% of former enslaved people claimed not just a Christian identity, but an enthusiastically Christian identity. And really full representation in the halls of government really didn't happen until, of course, independence from the mother country in 1962. And it was only then that Jamaicans were able to freely elect their own government.
So reading your book, reading about Sam Sharpe's rebellion speaks to like a broader discussion of emancipatory movements and the utilization of violence versus a nonviolent approach that would be espoused by someone like Gandhi. This would go on to the civil rights movement, where someone like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X would be like kind of diametrically posed against each other, as one being the beacon of nonviolence, the other one by any means necessary, implicitly suggesting that there could be violence. How does Sam Sharpe's rebellion and what occurred in Jamaica during that time period, how does that influence the discussion of violence versus nonviolence in terms of national or racial liberation?
It didn't influence it at all, and this is partly because it was very much in the interests of Britain and Jamaica, and certainly the United States, to forget any of this ever happened. It was a great embarrassment, a military humiliation, and also a dangerous example of what happens when enslaved people are exposed to the sense of
subversive ideas
of liberation. But there's a very important point here, because you're right that Sam Sharpe did anticipate Gandhi and MLK and other freedom movements, even some violent freedom movements, through his methodology. And the more you look at the Jamaican uprising, at least this was the case with me, I began to think that some of these methods are actually almost encoded into the collective consciousness of humanity. That Sam Sharpe didn't invent these techniques so much as he discovered them, as generations hence would discover them, that it actually works. And what I'm talking about here is again, in that literate and so-called elite, strata of oppressed peoples. You gain some knowledge about how the oppressive structure works. You cultivate through secret networks a group of lieutenants. Then you develop small cells, small decentralized little groups of people who share the ideology, are able to communicate the ideology. But to stamp out one of those cells is not to break the movement.
I guess to ask the question a little bit more directly, do you believe that Sam Sharpe's rebellion is more of evidence of the efficacy of nonviolent liberatory actions, or is it more evidence towards the efficacy of armed struggle as a tool of liberation?
Sure. No, that is a great question. And there is no one.
Because you had mentioned it's complicated. I know that there's very different factors. So it's hard to just pin it into like, okay, this is the Gandhi side versus the Malcolm X side.
Yeah. This always works and that never works. Yeah. Obviously, I'm sure every historian you have on this show will say some version of the sentence. It's complicated.
Right. As they should.
Have there been, hundreds of thousands of nonviolent movements that have been quickly crushed, and we might not even know about them because they just never got the airplay that they deserved. That's true. Just as there have been armed uprisings that have been quickly crushed and quickly forgotten.
Right.
This is one case of a nonviolent uprising that was both. It was crushed. There is no question. They hung the major participants and put down the rebellion, but it also succeeded. Because the effect was just so influential in Britain and provided such an opening for the political contingent that was already hankering for abolition that it gave them the opening they needed. So it occupies the role of a failed but successful revolution.
I'm just curious on your perspective of this, and I have no foreknowledge of whatever your opinions may be of certain current issues happening in the world, but reading through this book, I couldn't help but draw similarities or comparisons to situations that may be going on right now in, say, Israel and Gaza. Like, for example, Norman Finkelstein is someone who has looked at current situations in Gaza and had evoked things like Nat Turner, like the Nat Turner Rebellion as being a kind of like grotesque outgrowth of extremely oppressive conditions that obviously materialized in some very unfortunate ways, but it tracked into a broader movement of liberation. Do you think that there's validity to those types of comparisons?
I think what's unquestionable is that these revolutionary figures throughout history have been cited by various groups, and this is without any commentary on whether or not you agree with those groups. Of course, Norman Finkelstein is saying those things.
Yeah.
I mean, just as the example that now comes to mind, I'm sure there are many, are of the Tiananmen Square protesters
Right.
in 1989, building a papier-mâché Statue of Liberty and citing the words of the American founding documents. Successful revolutions will always inspire those kinds of comparisons, whether or not you happen to agree with the people doing the citations.
Right. I know we're just about out of time here. I guess the last thing I just wanted to ask you is, what is Sam Sharpe's legacy and the legacy of that revolt? What is the components of that legacy that are relevant today that people should be aware of?
Thank you. And that's a point that I had wanted to make on the last question. Those who are cited by those who are railing against unjust systems in the world should include Sam Sharpe in their number. He is well known in the Caribbean. I'm not going to at all pretend that I discovered this story. Absolutely not. It is part of the accepted canon of Caribbean history. But it is not a very well-known part of world history, and shamefully not a well-known part of British history or of American history, and it needs to be. This is a really remarkable story, and one can't help but look into its details without feeling just a great deal of admiration for what these guys went through.
Tom Zoellner, thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us today. Is there any like projects or things that you have that you'd like to promote while you're here for anybody that might be listening?
Thank you. Yes, I have a book coming out September 30th. It's called The Road Was Full of Thorns. And while this book is about British emancipation, this new book is about American emancipation and the role of enslaved people in making it happen. And this is not about Frederick Douglass. I mean, he's in there, of course.
Right.
But this is not about what you might call the rock stars of emancipation history, conventional emancipation history. This is about the ordinary people who took the enormous risk of fleeing a plantation after the Civil War had been declared and occupying something called a contraband camp, and how that was an underappreciated driver of Lincoln's emancipation policy. And it's the argument of this book that it would have happened much later were it not for this kinetic activity that the Union had no choice but to listen to.
Well, that book sounds incredible. And when it comes out later this year, maybe we'll get a copy of it and I can reach out to you and we can have another discussion about it.
That'd be great. Thank you, Patrick.
Right. Thank you so much, Tom. Appreciate you coming in and hanging out with us today.
So don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. Don't treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. My repertoire is USSR. PLO style, PLO style got thrown out the car. Rise for subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Rise for subversive plots. Red radical and fight them. Capitalism and democracy. Capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades